Welcome to the Shunned podcast. It's a new year, 2020, a whole new decade, and I'm going to keep exposing religions that use shunning as a tool to control people. Being at the beginning of a new year and a new decade, I kind of see big things in the future. More and more people are speaking out against these different cults or religious organizations, and I think there's really a lot of momentum building in the ex-Jehovah's Witness movement. I wanted to get this year and this new decade off to a great start. So one of the things that I've done is I've released a new website called xjwhelp.com. So again, that's xjwhelp.com. I've made videos to help answer some of the common questions that I get asked, some of the issues that I see come up that people are struggling with, and I'm going to continue to add to this library of videos there. There's a free downloadable roadmap to help you see where you are in your journey. There's resources where you can find local meetups, online meetups through the Shunned Recovery Project, other projects and books that might be of help, and even a live chat service or individual coaching if that's what you're looking for. I will continue to add to the site regularly. So to celebrate the release of xjwhelp.com, to celebrate the new year, the new decade, I'm releasing 10 episodes this month instead of 2. So, I just really wanted to do something to kind of blow it out. My initial goal was to do an episode a day for the whole month of January. That was a ridiculous goal that I could not meet, and that's okay too. But I've got 10 episodes ready to go, and I'm going to start releasing one a day, Monday through Friday for the next 2 weeks. So, I really wanted to kind of do something to show, there's so many people who are reaching out to me. It's really hard to keep up. There are so many of us out here that want to tell our stories, and that's an amazing thing. So in order to streamline this process of releasing so many, I'm not going to tell you who you're about to meet. You can read the description if you're interested in that. That way I can add this to the front of each episode without having to spend time recording each individually. So let's dive right into the interview and get to meet today's guest.
My name is Serena. I'm 33 years old. I was a Jehovah's Witness, and I am shunned.
All right, Serena, so how'd you come to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses in the first place?
I was actually born into it.
Born into it.
Yeah.
So what about your parents? Do you know how far, does this go back generations, or were they the first to come in?
So I'm at least a 4th generation Jehovah's Witness on my dad's side, maybe more. I'm not quite sure how far back his family goes. That's just as far as I'm aware of. He was definitely raised in it, but rebelled heavily a lot in his high school years. He did the whole worldly girlfriend, sex, drugs, the whole thing.
Yeah.
Which, looking back, just seems ironic to me, given my circumstance and the fact that they shun me. I always have found that odd.
Mm-hmm. Hypocritical?
Yeah, for sure. And then my mom was raised pretty rough. She had an abusive dad who ended up passing away when I think she was about 12 or so. So then she partied pretty hard, got pregnant really young. And I think she was just looking for something that gave her hope of a better life. So she had a cousin that started studying and ended up reaching out to her and preaching to her. And so I think that she really clung to that as some sort of hope. So she came into it, I believe, when she was about 18.
Yeah, a lot of times there's trauma in the background of somebody when they first start to get interested at a later age. Sounds like your mom had some there with her dad and everything.
Yeah, she definitely did.
Yeah, it's a shame. And then, being 4 generations back, that's pretty deep when you really sit and think about it in the organization.
Oh, yeah, it is. And I would be curious to know if it goes farther back than that. But that's as far back as I can remember. I remember going to meetings with, my great grandparents and my grandparents and being at all of the conventions with all of the family. So that's as far back as I'm aware.
So all of you together, that is an overlapping generation.
Yeah. Yeah.
The witnesses are onto something there.
They are.
So what was, you were born in, so you didn't really have a lot of choice. How did the religion make you see the world around you?
So I wasn't one of the ones that viewed the world around me as bad. I think I was always somewhat curious. I definitely viewed us as the lucky ones because we had some sort of hope and we knew something that none of them did. So, we hold out that as, oh, we're so lucky. We're so lucky to have this. And I didn't necessarily ever look down on people. I definitely wasn't the judgmental type, but I certainly felt like we were special.
Oh, you were missing out. That judgmental stuff was
Oh
fun.
yeah. I was one of the few.
No, I like that though, that you didn't really you felt special without having that piece where you looked down upon everybody.
Yeah.
Which is pretty is a better place to be.
Oh, definitely.
So what was childhood like at home for you? What was kind of the atmosphere when you were growing up?
Yeah, so I was the middle of three girls. I had a sister that was 2 years older and a sister that was 2 years younger. The good majority of our family was Jehovah's Witness, so it was really all that we knew. My mom was always super open to us telling us how her and my dad had actually got in trouble prior to getting married. So the real reason they actually got married was because they got pregnant with me.
Mm-hmm.
And she was pretty repentant from, how the story was told. So she was only privately reproved, I believe, where my dad, I believe, wasn't as repentant. And so he got disfellowshipped. And she would tell us stories of how she'd drag all three of us to meeting by herself, and dad would stubbornly stay home. She made it seem like we had her to thank for where we were. So thanks, Mom.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you can thank her.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that.
Appreciate it.
But at some point, my dad had heard from one relative, I think, who was pretty kind to him. It sounded like he felt a lot of people were super judgmental, but he had one of our relatives who treated him kindly and said something that he said eventually woke him up. So he was reinstated. As long as I can remember, he was a servant and then later an elder. That being the case, though, he obviously was an elder, but our home life was still pretty rough, which seems to be the case with a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
My parents were really young, and they always seemed like they were forced together by, their choices and the fact that they got pregnant with me. So they had absolutely zero patience growing up. My dad was always verbally abusive, and I recognized that he was a jerk, but I just never really viewed him as physically abusive. I guess I just thought that it was normal to have a belt print across your butt if you backtalk, or to wince if he came too close.
Mm-hmm.
I always remember preparing for the pain when he would walk by, like he's going to hit us, he's going to kick us, breathing that sigh of relief if by some chance he didn't smack us in the face or kick us in the butt with his heavy work boots. And I can recall one bad fight with my dad. I was maybe 14. I don't remember exactly what I said. I had a lot of attitude at the time, and so I often just said what was on my mind. And so my dad actually smacked me across the face, I think with the back of his hand, and busted my lip open. And I can very clearly remember my older sister stepping in the middle of it, which she had never done, and telling him that that was enough, that I'd had enough. And she took me to my room, listened to me cry as I told her how much I hated my dad. So it was kind of at that point that I thought, like, wait, maybe this isn't normal. Maybe it's not okay that he does this to us. Despite the way he treated me, especially, or us, and I, felt occasional hatred towards him, I was still a huge, huge daddy's girl. I liked to do whatever he did, following him around. He still was really playful with us. He would do foot races with us or have pillow fights, and I really lived for those times. I always was like the boy he never had, and so I'd soak up that one-on-one time with him.
Yeah.
I loved it. My mom, she was not really abusive. She was more distant. She just always seemed stressed, anxious. She was cold. She seemed really bitter at how her life turned out. Her and I had a pretty tense relationship. I always knew that she loved us very much. She put the needs of us ahead of her own. I can remember particularly how hard she worked to pay for our first trip to Disneyland. That was something that she really wanted for us. And I loved it because she seemed like a totally different person while we were there. And it was very rare. And I really loved seeing her like that.
Yeah.
It
Yeah,
was
away from the
awesome.
stress and in a different environment, she could, just be fun.
Yeah, yeah, and it was definitely rare to see her like that because the rest of the time she was just so high strung. We were pretty diligent witnesses throughout our childhood. We barely missed a meeting. We were out in service every Saturday. It was exhausting. Tuesdays, we would come home from school, do our homework, get ready for meeting, go to meeting, get home late. I remember being exhausted the next day at school only to have to do it again Thursday night.
Yep.
One thing I remember very clearly is I always had stomach aches. I would get stomach aches,
Oh,
or I would pretend that I had stomach aches just to stay home. And in my teenage years, they actually ended up becoming pretty debilitating. I, couldn't make it out in service, couldn't go to meetings, which my parents had a hard time with. My mom eventually took me to doctors trying to find out what was wrong. And looking back, I really think that it was just anxiety, that
yep.
I had so much anxiety about going to meetings and how I felt when I was there that it just, showed through these terrible stomach aches.
And
So
I'm
that was
sure that
always,
your dad, walking on eggshells around him probably didn't help any either.
yeah,
My wife I think she talked about, I think on episode 1, she had the stomach aches too. And, she
yeah.
also had a kind of volatile dad, and you didn't know how he was going to be or who was going to get hit, or if they were going to get hit. And, the stress of that, and then just going to meetings and stuff and not really fitting in or feeling at home
hmm
there. She had a lot of stomach issues too.
And it's so funny how, as a kid, you don't recognize that that's, anxiety
Yeah.
showing itself. It's one of those things that you can't pinpoint why it is. And you look back and you're like, oh, that's what that was.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So we constantly had responsibility. I remember just feeling like we always had somewhere to be, something to do. On the nights we didn't have meeting, we were studying for meetings or having family worship night. My mom was usually the one who would try to keep us on track. Although my dad was an elder, he usually only did things at my mom's urging, so she would kind of have to push him to do them.
Yeah.
We would have our family study. It was one of those things that she really would push him, hey, we haven't done this in a while. We should do it. She'd get all of us together, feeling guilty that it had been a while. And then inevitably, the night would always end with us getting yelled at. We
Mhm.
either didn't participate enough or we were talking too much and not paying attention. So I remember as a kid hating it. We all hated it. And I'm sure that my parents hated it. I'm sure it wasn't enjoyable for them either, but I hated family study.
That's relatable.
Yeah, it was awful. And then my parents went through a phase where they drank pretty heavily. I can remember, especially when I was really young, my parents drank a lot. They would go on the wagon, as they always told us, hey, we're on the wagon right now, because they would just be killing a case of beer every night and they'd start to recognize that maybe that, was a problem.
Mm.
I remember it seemed like almost all of the elders that I knew drank a lot. I never really thought a whole lot of it. We'd
Yeah.
go to, events and all of the elders would just be drinking a case of beer. So it kind of always seemed like that one vice that, since technically it wasn't off limits, that they all had a problem with.
Absolutely.
Definitely. I was always a kid that wanted to be the best witness. I wanted to make my parents happy. I decided to become an unbaptized publisher around 7 or 8. That was when I started doing talks. I got baptized at 12, which, was pretty young, but I remember thinking like, oh, my parents are just going to be so proud of me. I'm going to be the youngest of my
Yeah.
siblings to get baptized. Like it was definitely one of those things that I was very proud of. I can remember looking back, my parents were so proud of me that they bought me a Winnie the Pooh watch as a congratulatory gift, which, looking back, I keep thinking any kid who's young enough to get excited about Winnie the Pooh is too young to be making choices that affect the rest of their life. Like, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, but if I got that excited about a Winnie the Pooh watch, I probably shouldn't be making this big of a choice.
That's true. That's true. Well, let me ask you. So, what led up to your baptism, or what Do you remember, like, was it a desire to please your parents, press,
It did. It
pressure, or?
definitely. It was really a desire to please my parents. My older sister, was a lot more rebellious, and you could tell that she really only did what was required of her. She was kind of the bare minimum. You could tell she wasn't into it. She never really took it to heart. And I think that I always aimed to be the one that did take it to heart, that really like aimed to please my parents. I felt the need to make up for her lack of interest in it. So I was always much more hardcore than she was, attempting to make them happy.
Wow. Yeah, I'm always interested in, what it is that pushes somebody to do that. Because there's a lot of different reasons that people end up getting baptized. And at 12 years old, your reasons are going to be different probably than as you get older, I appreciate what you said about the Winnie the Pooh watch. And also we were talking in one of the Shunned Recovery Project groups about baptism and just how, when you think about it, for a kid who's never had holidays or birthdays or felt special in any way, when you think about it, getting baptized is the one time that you can do something and everybody's happy for you. People see you walking around with the wet hair and they know that, oh, you must have got dunked. And so everybody is, singing your praises. And it's the one time you get to feel special. And what an appeal that is to kids.
Oh, it definitely was. And in our area, I don't know if this was the case throughout, but a lot of times when you got baptized here, someone would get you a Bible that was,
Yep.
the personal Bible with your name on it. And I had one sister who was my parents' age that I was really close to, and she got me this super nice, like burgundy leather bound Bible with my name on it and gave it to me at the convention that I got baptized at. And I just remember feeling like on top of the world, because it really was one of the few occasions that you got gifts and you were, kind of made the center of attention. So it just felt good to have that praise.
Yeah, and you just think about how manipulative it sounds to basically take away any opportunity of a child ever being praised or feeling special, except for if they do this one thing, which is joining, the religion officially. It's a pretty bleak thing, really, when you think
really
about it.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you don't know at that age, you don't ever assume I'm not going to feel the same way. So the fact that the choices you make at 12 are held against you in your 20s or your 30s or for the rest of your life, to me, that's so warped. I've mentioned that to my parents in arguments since I've left. Like, do you realize that at 12 years old, I was not mentally capable of making a choice like that? Because they always say, well, you chose this. You chose to get baptized. And I'm like, yes, at 12 years old.
Yes. And it sounds like your parents maybe had some decisions at 12 that they didn't want to live up to their whole life.
My mom would still be drinking and smoking if she was stuck to her 12-year-old choices.
Right. And it's okay for them to change and leave another religion. And it would be awful if their parents or whoever from that other religion had shunned them. But, when it goes the other way, it's okay. So,
yeah, it's very much a religion based on double standards.
Absolutely. It's double speak like the book 1984.
Yes, exactly.
So, how did things go at school for you? Did you find any relief there?
I didn't. For me, I really struggled because, like most Jehovah's Witnesses, we weren't really allowed to do any of the extracurricular activities or get involved in sports at school. I was a huge tomboy, so I struggled with that. I always wanted something that kind of made me feel part of the team. The holidays would roll around and we would go to the library, sit out, missing out on all of the parties. I did feel proud that I was taking that stand, but I mean, you're still as a kid going to yearn for being a part of that, and you're always set apart. So you struggle being set apart. The Christmas programs, all of the treats, always having to explain every single year why you didn't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. You'd have a new teacher, new class, you'd have to explain to them. But I remember it always trying to be ingrained into us that we have that sense of pride that we were different because we were pleasing Jehovah. So I was one that tried to focus on that. I never got super close with kids from school because I knew that I had to hold them, off at a distance. We couldn't do anything after school. One thing that I find odd, and it applies to my kids when they're at their dad's house, is I remember like kids in the neighborhood, we could play with them out in the street, but we could never play with them in either person's house or backyard.
Hmm.
And I just thought that was so odd. Like, I'm allowed to be around them here, but not here. And it just seemed odd to me as a little kid that distinction was made.
Yeah, it's like you can be friends, but not too close of friends, where you
Yes.
really get intimate in someone's home,
Yeah.
where you really get to know them.
Yep. You talk to them in the front yard, you play in the
Yeah,
front yard, weren't to ever see what the inside of their house was and vice versa. And it was really
interesting.
odd to me. And it's odd to me looking back because my ex-husband does the exact same thing with my children when they're with him.
Mm.
And so I relate that to them and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, wow.
And then when it was really odd, so my parents decided to take all three of us out of school once we finished middle school. It kind of came about by necessity because they feared that my older sister was starting to take an interest in boys. So we obviously couldn't meet any worldly boys. And so they took us out of school, and it seemed a lot of the local Jehovah's Witnesses, which it sounds like from other people was the case in a lot of areas. Here, a lot of older Jehovah's Witnesses ended up homeschooling and enrolling in like correspondence school.
Yep.
Yeah, so we did that and we were supposed to homeschool, but we never really did. And we got busy and we'd be going out in service. And so eventually we all just got our GEDs. I got my GED when I was 16, just got it over with. And, that was kind of my education. I really felt like I missed out. I struggled missing out on all of those high school events. I'd look at, what I thought high school was supposed to be like, and I would feel sad that I was never going to have that opportunity. I think by that point, I was starting to realize how different we were from everybody else.
Yeah.
So that was always really hard. It was about that time. So when my older sister turned 18, which was right around the time that I was finishing up like school, my older sister started to rebel. She started to avoid meetings. She started to talk to worldly boys that she'd meet, at the mall, different places. I remember I would listen at the door to the fights that she had with my parents. I was so terrified listening to these fights play out. My dad had told her that if she couldn't follow their rules, then she had to get out of their house. So she ended up leaving. She was disfellowshipped shortly after that, which I took pretty hard. Her and I fought a lot when we were young, but, we're sisters. That's kind of how life goes. But she was still my best friend. So I started to withdraw pretty heavily at that point. Eventually, my mom decided that I needed to go to the doctor. So that was actually the first time in my life, I was about 16, that I was diagnosed with depression
Mm-hmm.
and had to be put on medication for that. My mom spoke to my sister occasionally. I remember at one point, probably a year after she left, she got really sick. And so she had to be taken care of and came back home and lived with us. I think that for my dad as an elder, he was obviously really against the disfellowshipped daughter coming back home, but my mom didn't really give him a choice. She knew that my sister needed her. And so she pretty much just said, this is what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then my sister got better. I think she was home maybe about 6 months. And so she got well and very shortly thereafter decided that, she was good and she was going to leave. So she left again. We couldn't talk to her, very often at that point, all over again. She eventually got pregnant and got married. It was really tough because none of us could go to her wedding. She, got married out of the obligation of, look, now we're having a baby, and none of us could be there for that. So I struggled with that. Once she had the baby, there was this huge shift in how my parents treated her. It was like 2 years after she left, they now saw her all the time. She had my niece that they wanted to see. So she would come over with my niece. She'd come over for dinner. She was suddenly now okay simply because she had a baby and they wanted to be around my niece. And so
Man, I
I
hate
can,
that.
right.
That's
And
so
just,
disgusting.
it's so confusing. I think at
Yes.
16, I thought, okay, look, you have forced me for 2 years to cut her off and to have so little to do with her.
Yeah.
And now she's here all the time, which looking back for her is amazing that she had that opportunity. But I really struggled with, wait, you have told me that this is not what we're supposed to be doing. And then all of a sudden it's what you're doing.
Yeah, and it has
And
to be confusing for her too, because it's like, oh, now that I've produced a child and you're interested in the grandchild,
mhm,
suddenly I'm okay to come over. Suddenly I exist again.
yeah,
And a lot of times it's just so that they can try to indoctrinate the grandchild. But,
yes.
you know.
Yep. And I felt like we couldn't really talk about her to people in the Kingdom Hall
Hmm.
because I knew that, like, my dad as an elder or us as, fairly strong Jehovah's Witnesses, that it wasn't necessarily okay that we saw her so often. And so I would feel like I had to leave that information out just simply so that it didn't come back to bite my parents in the butt that they did see her. And then they pressured her pretty hard, which I'm sure was part of their motivation for having her around to
Hmm.
get reinstated. Obviously, now she has a kid. For the sake of her child, she should get reinstated. And so she, she definitely was super pressured. They did have her in their lives, but I think at that point they hid it quite a bit. And so she made it through. She did the 6 months of coming to meetings. I remember we would save her a seat at every meeting. She'd come in, we'd help her with my niece, and she came, she did it, she put in the work, and then the announcement was soon made that she was reinstated. So we were all really happy to have her back, even though she'd been there. And now, we could openly have her in our lives. And so that was really nice. It was nice to be able to invite her to do things with the witnesses again and not have to hide that we had a relationship with her. During the time that she was gone, I struggled. As I mentioned before, the depression hit. I felt a ton of pressure at that time to just be the epitome of a good Jehovah's Witness teen. I think I was trying to make up for what I saw my parents go through with her, with my sister.
Yeah.
I wanted to be the polar opposite. I didn't want to put them through the pain that I watched them go through with her. So I started working. At that time, I had my GED. I started working full time with my dad. I started auxiliary pioneering, really just attempting to do whatever I could to follow the rules and to be that example of, hey, this teen is setting the example for what teens should be like.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, it was. And I rebelled a little. Like, looking back, I can remember a few things that I definitely pushed the limits on, but they were all so minor. I mean, look, compared to even some of the Jehovah's Witness teens in the hall, my rebellions were pretty little. And then when I was 16, I had started to spend a lot of time with the regular pioneer. She was in her mid 20s and attempted to, like, take me under her wing.
Hmm.
So she introduced me to a guy, 16 years old. She decided to introduce me to a guy from out of state. And, who doesn't encourage a 16-year-old to start to get settled down?
With
Totally
someone
normal.
out of state. Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
totally normal.
So him and I hit it off. We obviously, at that time, cell phones weren't as much of a thing. So we communicated first by email for that first year. We just emailed each other back and forth, getting to know each other. And then when I turned 17, my parents said that we could officially start dating. So we started dating when I turned 17. He was 4 years older than me. So he was, legally an adult.
Hmm. Yeah, he could drink.
Yeah, exactly. And, by worldly standards, that wouldn't have been allowed, but
Hmm.
my parents allowed it. So I was 17. We eventually got married. So I turned 18 in May and we got married in October. So I think we got engaged right as I turned 18. I was legal. It was suddenly okay for him to propose.
Hmm.
So we got engaged and then planned the wedding shortly thereafter. So we were married right away as soon as I was legally able to. Um, We got married at an outside venue, which back then was
Oh,
pretty scandalous as
yeah,
Jehovah's
yeah.
Witnesses.
So what are you saying, that you weren't able to get married in a kingdom hall?
That's what I think people like really whispered about us, wondering if we just weren't allowed to, if that was the
Yep.
case. Why did you make this choice? What did they do that they can't get married in the Kingdom Hall? We could, and I remember my mom just being dumbfounded that we didn't want to, but I thought the Kingdom Hall was so ugly.
It
And
is.
it was just hideous and it was so stuffy, and I just didn't want that, feeling at my wedding. And so we pushed and we had it at an outside venue, which was just a big deal back then.
Yeah.
And at the time, my sister, she was still disfellowshipped, and I really wanted her to come. And so in my mind, I thought if we had the wedding at an outside venue, then she would be allowed to come. But actually, an elder ended up getting wind of that and had come to my parents and said that if she came, then the brothers and sisters would choose not to come. And if we had it in the hall, she was allowed to come. But if we had it outside the Kingdom Hall, she was not allowed to come. And so
What?
that made no sense to me.
No, that makes
No
zero
sense at
sense.
all. And here I'm thinking the opposite. It would be outside the Kingdom Hall. She'd be allowed. I knew that she would just be able to come, sit in the back, not speak to anyone, leave after the ceremony. I knew that that was what she would do either way. But the fact that it wasn't allowed because it was outside the Kingdom Hall was just so hard for me to accept. I was really upset at that time. I hated that she wasn't able to come. So I took that pretty hard that, she didn't get to be there. And I was so confused by it.
Yeah, because again, double standards are, weird. Their reasoning is not always very, it's not something you can easily follow.
No, the logic just isn't there.
No.
It's okay here, but it's not okay there. Like, I was so confused. After we got married, I remember thinking like I'd made it. I'd had succeeded for the end goal, which is to marry into the truth, to have, a good Jehovah's Witness spouse. And so I thought like I'd made it through the teenage hormones. I didn't have sex before marriage. Like, I married this good J-Dub boy. Like, I've succeeded.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd officially made it, is how I viewed it at first.
Happily ever after, riding
Yeah.
off into the sunset.
Exactly. So I moved to his state because at that point it was still long distance. So I moved to his state after we got married. And again, at that time, I fell into another really dark depression. I was out on my own for the first time. I was away from my family, the congregation that I'd grown up in. And I was just really ill prepared for the real world, any sort of real relationship. Like, I wasn't prepared for the reality of any of that.
Yeah.
And so it really pushed me into this really dark depression, which was confusing because I thought, I'm a newlywed. This is supposed to be the happiest time of my life. We're supposed to be like in wedded bliss right now.
Mm-hmm.
And we weren't. And that was hard. My parents never really set a very good example of marriage. They fought all the time. And so I took that into my own marriage. My husband and I had our first fight after we'd been married. I believe it was a few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I didn't talk to him for days. I'm like, hey, this is what mom and dad did after they fought. This must be how I'm supposed to do this.
We all took a lot of dysfunction from our parents into our marriages.
And I feel so bad looking back for his sake, because I really I cold shouldered him for days. And I just thought that was normal until he finally broke the silence and was like, look, we can't live our lives with this. And I still struggle to this day to not emulate some of those things that they did in their marriage, because it is so ingrained in me.
Yeah. And they actually have magazines, ironically, an organization that practices organizationally sanctioned shunning has articles about not giving people the silent treatment because it's not good for your marriage.
Isn't that ironic?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That was a hard time for me, just trying to figure out who I was on my own, what I was. We worked really hard, him and I, to to be at all the meetings, to be out in service. We did the constant carousel of the, expectations. It just was now in a new state, a new congregation. So this same, just constant requirements and constant expectation. It was still there. It was just in a new area. So that was really hard. It's just back on, the horse and you keep going. We fast forward 4 years, we had our daughter. So I felt at that time life was really following the expected progression that it should follow. I thought, this is what I'm supposed to do in life. I've been married. We were one of the few who didn't have kids right away. We waited a few years. It seemed like a lot of the people that got married young had kids right away. Where, we definitely waited, which was probably a saving grace for us. One of the monumental moments for me, it was a few months after my daughter was born. I was struggling to find out how to be a new mom, baby with colic. I got a call. At this point, I was out of state. My parents lived here in Idaho. I got a call. I don't even remember who it was from. I think it was my older sister. And she told me that my mom had attempted suicide. And I knew that when I would go back to visit her, which I did often, especially after having the baby, that she seemed sad. She would sometimes stay in bed for days. My trips over there were times where she would, get up and do things. So I knew she had some issues, but I was extremely shocked to hear that she had attempted suicide.
Yeah.
And
that's hard.
It was really hard for me. And I think just trying to accept that I was out of state during that, I came over and I took care of her for a week. I left my baby back home with my husband. She was only, I think, 2 months old at the time. And I came and I took care of my mom. She was in a hospital for about a week. It was at that time that she was actually diagnosed as bipolar. Mental health was just never really something that was talked about. I don't know if all families were that way, but in our family, you just didn't really address mental health. And so
you weren't even really supposed to address it in the congregation. I mean, for years, there was a stigma against it that was against even going to see a therapist or anything. So yeah, it wasn't talked about much.
Yeah. And I think for my dad, he would, from the stories that I heard, he would have brothers and sisters come to him as, an elder who counsels them and say that they were struggling with depression or mental health issues behind closed doors. And I think he always viewed it as a farce. Like it wasn't a real thing.
Yeah.
Mental health, depression, it was a choice and people were just being lazy. They didn't actually have a problem. And so when my mom was officially diagnosed as bipolar, it smacked him in the face. He had to accept that it was a real thing and that she clearly did have a real issue. So after she had her week in the hospital, she comes out and then all of a sudden it was like it never happened. No one talked about it. No one addressed it. I was so frustrated that my dad and the people at the Kingdom Hall just brushed it under the rug.
Yep.
And meanwhile, my sisters and I were super traumatized. All of us, it hit us really hard. It was one of those moments that's just so pivotal for me. At that point, I viewed my mom a lot differently. I cherished her after that. We hadn't been close prior, but I started to call her every day. I was worried, so I would fear the worst if for some reason she didn't answer the phone. I eventually talked to my husband and we moved back to where my family is, in large part due to the need to be near her. I wanted to be sure that I could keep an eye on her because I felt like my dad just tried to ignore the problem.
Yeah.
So I felt a lot of responsibility personally to make sure she was okay. And I think it was also that I related to her. I related already in my, short years of struggle with depression. I knew what she was going through. I knew what she must be feeling. And I would try to tell her that. As I mentioned, nobody else really talked about it. So I would try to tell her, it's okay that you feel this way. I often feel that way too. And trying to open that door to talk about mental health. So I took it upon myself to try to be there for her, to really push her to get out of bed when things were bad because I knew what it was like. 2 years after the birth of my daughter, my husband and I had our son. We were doing pretty well in the congregation, but after my son's birth, we really struggled. I always felt like I wasn't doing enough. My mom would say, so and so is a regular pioneer
Yes.
and they have kids. You're not working. Why aren't you a regular pioneer? And I just always felt I wasn't good enough. I wasn't meeting the expectation. Looking back, I think some of that pressure definitely was self-imposed because I am super hard on myself, and I thought, why can't I do this? Why can't I
But
regular pioneer?
yeah, but so much of that comes from the pages of the Watchtower and the talks and
Yes.
it's constant. One of the most common refrains I hear from people who are out is that they maybe still, but at least then, always felt like they were never enough.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really common thing. The organization is so performance driven, and it's so perfectionistic in the way it presents things that you're taught almost to shame yourself if you can't live up to whatever arbitrary standard they've set.
Oh yeah. And you just always feel like you're falling short. I remember thinking like, oh, I didn't meet the average for service
Yeah,
this month.
yeah.
I'm not even average. Like I wanted to be above average and I couldn't even be average. And that was so hard on me at that time. My son had extreme colic. And so the reality of trying to take a screaming baby and a feisty 2.5-year-old to meeting or out in service just had me at my absolute breaking point. I couldn't do it. I would find excuses to stay home. I couldn't do it. I look back and I know that I probably had some sort of postpartum depression, but again, we didn't really address mental health.
Yeah.
So I would just find these excuses to stay home, to skip service. My husband eventually took a second job at that point, so he really wasn't home very often. And so I certainly wasn't going to drag them all the time by myself, especially to service. My mom, come out with us, we'll help you. But it just was miserable. The whole process was miserable for me at that point.
Yeah, they have no recognition that life changes when you have kids or anything like that. The standards or the expectations never shift. They don't say, you're a new mom, why don't you take it easy on yourself for a little bit?
Yeah.
No, it's like, you're a new mom. You need to start your baby out in life as one of Jehovah's Witnesses by going out in the ministry constantly and
Get
showing
them on
how
the
it's
right
done.
track.
Yeah. Timothy was a toddler when he was taught or whatever. It's from infancy. So it's the expectations to perform never go away.
Yeah, and the idea of having a baby strapped in a car seat and a toddler strapped in a car seat, especially in the winter with all their warm clothes. And I always got really car sick. So service was pretty miserable for me. And then my daughter got car sick too. So we would be nauseous in the back seat, just absolutely dreading life. I absolutely hated it. Or you'd end up in a car where someone had the heater cranked up.
Oh, yes.
And you're just dying, or their car smelled funny and you're like, oh, I can't do this.
So many times I would ask, can I crack a window?
Yes. You're
Just for
so
some fresh air,
to
please.
speak up. Please just let us get to break time. At least at break, I can let the kids out of the car. And
It's just Jehovah's happy people.
Yeah, just doing, what they just feel like they just love to do every day. It was so miserable. And I felt what's wrong with me that I am so miserable when I'm out? It just really must be a terrible person because I hate service and I can't admit that I hate it.
Oh, you're supposed to love it.
Yeah, I'm supposed to just, soak it up. So it was just odd. My husband never really seemed fazed by the stress. I felt like I was drowning. I was completely overwhelmed, and it just never seemed to faze him, which I think I resented him for. Why is this so hard for me and not for you? Granted, he worked, and so he wasn't constantly in it all day long and didn't have the pressure to do the midweek activities, but I just really struggled with the fact that I was overwhelmed and he wasn't. So
And I'm guessing if you, well, let me just ask. So,
yeah,
did you ever express to him how overwhelmed you were, and how did he react to that?
I would. And he always thought, okay, you just need a break. So the break
Yeah.
was always, I'll keep the kids and you can go grocery shopping by yourself. And I'm just like,
How
my,
awesome and thoughtful.
yeah, thank you so much. And so I would go to Walmart and I would find excuses to have to shop for 2 hours just because my sanity needed it. I needed to just be away. He didn't put a ton of pressure on me when I would say like, hey, I just can't get them to meetings today. Like I can't do it. He would understand and he knew that it was hard. He certainly, hey, we should really try, like we should try harder. I felt like he was never an overachiever. So at that point, we'd been married, gosh, like 6 years at that point, and he had still not made it as a ministerial servant, which my parents always commented, like, why is your husband not a servant yet? So he never
What
really,
the heck?
yeah, like by that point, they're like, he's in his mid-20s. Like he certainly should be a servant, maybe even an elder. His best friend was an elder already at that point. And so a lot of the people in our congregation were like, what's wrong with him? But it was just that he kind of skated by. He wanted to be at the meetings and he wanted to be out in service and he would encourage me to go, but he never pushed it and he never really pushed himself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So that was just one of those circumstances where he would kind of cave to it and be like, okay, well, I guess tonight we will stay home.
Wow. Wow. But, yeah. So he would stay home if you couldn't get the kids. I just saw a lot of, and this, could be anecdotal, but, or it is, but I saw a lot of dads, husbands, who had wives and kids, and the wife was expected to do everything to get the kids ready for anything, while the husband was just taking care of himself. And there wasn't a lot of really great support. I mean, it really kind of came down to like, people talk about on Facebook, you'll see people talk about husbands quote babysitting their kids as if they aren't their kids.
Yeah.
Like I saw that a lot in the witnesses.
Yeah. And I was pretty fortunate that for the most part, he was really supportive. I could say, like, this is what I need you to do, and he would do it. Otherwise, I think I would have missed all the meetings. Like, okay, their clothes are laid out. I need you to feed them. I need you to get this one dressed while I get this one dressed. My dad was never involved with us that way.
Yeah,
so
same here.
I was very adamant that I was not going to put up with that because I knew growing up that my mom did everything alone. So I was really fortunate that I could lay it all out and I would have the support. Otherwise, I think I would have struggled even more so.
Yeah.
It was kind of at this time I felt like I was starting to have a nervous breakdown. My son was like a year old. He still was struggling to sleep. I was struggling to do the things I was supposed to do. My husband worked 2 jobs and was gone all of the time. So this is about the time that Facebook started to become popular and people started to join Facebook, which there was a lot of controversy over whether or not you had a Facebook at that time.
Yep.
If you were one of the ones that did, then you probably weren't as spiritual as some of the ones that chose not to. And I ended up becoming Facebook friends with a guy that I had grown up with. He grew up Jehovah's Witness with us, but was no longer a Jehovah's Witness. And we just saw each other on Facebook and became Facebook friends.
Mm-hmm.
So this was really the catalyst to my bad decisions. I just had this whole mental breakdown. And I decided 3 weeks from the time that I had started talking to him that I couldn't do it anymore. I didn't want to be a Jehovah's Witness, or I at least couldn't handle it anymore. I sat down my husband. I told him I was leaving. I told him I'm done. I just was like at absolute nervous breakdown point.
Yeah.
I almost didn't even recognize like who I was and the things that were coming out of my mouth. I look back and it's like I'm watching someone else's life.
Oh yeah. I mean, people, when you put people under enough pressure, eventually they do kind of break.
Yeah, and I really had. So I knew I was in the wrong. I couldn't do it anymore, and so I started to get obviously all of the negative comments that as soon as I told him, and he, broke down. He calls my dad while I'm still in the room and tells my dad that, Serena's leaving. She doesn't want to be married anymore. She doesn't want to be a witness. And I was just in this fog. I was in this haze. My parents started to call me, to text me. They were just blowing me up with all of these negative comments. My dad pretty much told me that I was a worthless human being.
Because
My
that
mom,
really helps, doesn't it?
yeah, it
You
helps
know?
the situation so
Yeah.
much. Like, you're having a mental breakdown. Let's just make it
Yeah,
worse.
let's pile on.
Yeah. And my mom, she would tell me that if I did choose to leave, that I was ruining my kids' lives. That was something that, as a mom who was really involved with her kids, that hit me super hard. I took it so personally. I'm not allowed to crack because my kids needed me. And so if I did crack, their lives were ruined.
Yeah.
It was
Very
November 12th.
unfair.
Oh, it is. It's so unfair. And they never could provide the support or the help that you needed. Like, okay, clearly you're not okay. What can we do to help? Or maybe you need to get in to see a mental health
Yeah,
professional.
they don't see
Like,
you at all.
no, maybe we need to get you into counseling. And I remember for months just feeling like I was waving this white flag that nobody saw. I mean, I was
Yeah.
writing poetry that kind of laid out how I felt, and my husband would read the poems, and I'm like, these are my white flags. Like, why is no one seeing this? And
Yeah, they just see
I
you
felt,
as a problem to be fixed, not a person.
yeah, and I just felt so alone
Yeah.
when my husband was at work. I was just home with the kids in this constant state of just feeling like nobody was there for me.
Yeah.
And it was hard. um the next part's always really hard for me to talk about, so I feel like I'm sometimes vague just because it is so emotional. So in the midst of all of this, I just can't do it. It's not that I don't believe it's the truth. I just can't keep up anymore. I don't want to be married. We're so different worlds apart at that time in our marriage. And so November 14th, 2012, I had spent the day at work getting ripped apart over text message by all of my family. And like I said, it's really hard to explain the details of what progressed that day because it is super emotional. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, and after all that had happened, I went to our house. I kissed my babies goodbye, and I ended up downing 2 bottles of sleeping pills. One was a prescribed sleeping pill, and the other was a bottle of over the counter sleeping pills. Because I remember thinking, if one bottle doesn't do it, surely two will.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided at that point, my kids, my family, they were all better off. They didn't need this horrible mother that was going to ruin their lives.
Mm-hmm.
So I took these sleeping pills, kissed them, ran out the house in tears, and I drove away. Within just a few minutes, I could feel it all kicking in, and I knew I couldn't drive any farther. So I pulled into this gas station parking lot. I shut off my car. It was November, so it was freezing cold outside. And I remember looking around thinking, this is it. Like, these are the last moments. I had felt at that point my heart start to slow down. It felt like it was barely beating in my chest. And when the beat was getting so slow and I had accepted it, like, all of a sudden I just snapped and I was like, no, like, this isn't how it's going to end. This spark inside of me ignited. And I knew at that point, like, I wasn't going to let them win. Like, I had made crappy choices, but I knew that I didn't deserve to die. I know that my kids needed me. I know that, they needed their mother. They needed to have their mother through their life. And so at that point, I could barely put one foot in front of the other to actually physically move because of all of the drugs kicking
Sure.
in. So I was somehow able to get out of the car and drag myself into the store at the gas station. and I mumbled an almost unintelligible call 911 to the store clerk. And I remember they asked me several times, what are you saying? And I just kept saying, call 911. At that point, I weighed only 112 pounds. So it really was a miracle that I didn't die.
Mm.
Because
you took so many pills versus your weight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. They really were shocked that it didn't kill me. It was a miracle that somehow I was still there. And my suicide attempt was kind of the final straw for my family and my husband. They showed up to the psychiatric ward. You get put on the, 72-hour psychiatric watch. And they showed up to the psychiatric ward and actually ended up yelling at me so much in the visitor room that they had to ask us to go into a private room because my mom was screaming at me.
What the hell?
And I'm in the psychiatric ward, just like staring off into space, thinking like, I can't deal with them anymore. And they were pretty well done with me at that point. They felt that if I was going to make a choice like that, then I just didn't deserve to be in their life anymore. They
Didn't
told me
your
that
mom attempt?
That was what got me the most. So my mother attempted suicide. What was it? 4 years prior.
Yes.
She spent a week in the psychiatric ward. And I thought, you of all people should understand how I feel. You of all people
God.
should know what it's like to get this dark. And she was the one yelling at me, telling me that, I was this terrible person. I had left my husband. I was ruining my kids' lives, screaming at me to the point where they were like, ma'am, we have to ask you to go in a private room. You're upsetting the other patients.
Well, and shame had gotten them so far already. It's really sad because it's like the only tactic that Jehovah's Witnesses have, which goes to show that this isn't about love. This is about control. And so in order to try to get you back in line, to control you, the only tool they really have is to shame you.
Mm-hmm.
Which just shows, because if it was actually love, it would be, look, sweetie, what's going on? What's wrong? Let's talk. How can we work this out? What would be a better course? How are you feeling? Talk to me. And instead it's, you're a terrible person and, you're abandoning people, and it's just shame, shame, shame. And it's the tool of Jehovah's Witnesses is shame. And it's what they have to offer. And I'm sure your mom probably felt some measure of shame for her own attempt. So she has to double down on shaming you if that's the only tool she has to try to control this, they think they're going to fix things through shame, which never works.
Yeah. And to just not have the sympathy from her, especially. I mean, I knew, just given all of the crappy things that I had done, I knew that, my relationship with my then husband was over. But the fact that my mom, who couldn't sympathize, and to say, all of this crap aside, you're my daughter. I relate things now, having kids, differently. Like, I look back and I think, if that were my daughter, I would tell the husband to get out of the hospital and to take over as the mother, to say, what do I need to do just to have my daughter live? Yeah. That's my priority. Everything else aside, that's my priority. And the fact that she didn't, I really struggled with. And then my dad, he didn't even show up to the hospital to see me. Like, at that point, he was so mortified at the choices I'd made and who I'd become. Like, he didn't even come and see me. And they did have one of the brothers come to the ward, which I didn't actually know, because they just told me that a pastor was here, because that was, the worldly way of relating it. So they said, a pastor's here to see you. And I thought, well, I don't want to talk to a pastor. So I turned him away, and was only later told that it was actually an elder that I knew growing up, who had come to try to, talk some sense into me. So after my suicide attempt, it was pretty clear that I was on my own. My family had decided they were going to cut me off. I was fresh out of the hospital at that point, found myself homeless. I was being kept from my kids as much as possible because, they felt that I was a danger to myself and to them. And I understood to some degree where they were coming from. And so I just followed their requirements for when I could see my kids. I could go see my
Mhm.
kids as long as my mom sat there while I saw them. And so I struggled with that quite a bit, as having gone from a full-time provider of my kids to then being at their mercy for when I saw them.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
they take
I
control of everything.
Oh, they do. And, they wouldn't talk to me while I sat there with my kids. They would just simply babysit me while I was there, not attempting, at that point to try to help or to reach out and see if there was any saving me. Like, they just gave up saving me at that point.
Yeah, and you weren't disfellowshipped or anything, right?
No, I hadn't been. Like, I
I
had
mean,
been reproved and privately reproved. And so only my family really knew the degree of like my sins at that point.
right.
Um, but yeah,
Which
they
means
just,
they had a choice. They had a choice to speak to you or to not speak to you.
mm-hmm.
They had a choice to show love and empathy or to just shame you and control you. And it's a shame, yeah, what choices these people make constantly. I mean, talk about you've talked a lot about bad choices. Talk about bad choices. The way they deal with people who are hurting. I've always liked the phrase, they shoot their wounded. They don't
Oh
help
yeah.
them. They just shoot them and get rid of them. It's terrible.
Yeah. And I put so much of the blame on myself at that
Of
point. Like,
course.
I'm a bad person. I've done wrong.
Yep.
I'm worthless. I'm this or that. When in reality, a lot of it was just like such unaddressed mental health. I'm such a proponent of mental health and people talking about mental health now
Yes.
because of the way that I was raised and because of the inability to discuss it and to say, like, I'm not okay. You just didn't say that. You just buckled down and you got through, and you never said I'm not okay.
Yeah.
It wasn't allowed. And when I finally cracked, they just completely wrote me off. I never blamed them for shunning me because, like I said, I just felt like I deserved it.
Mm-hmm.
It was how I was raised. I knew that it was what they were supposed to do. I had done wrong, shun me, and I accepted it. Uh, I started to try to fumble my way into some sort of stability. I got an apartment right near my old home. I had my kids as often as I could. At that point, I had proved to be, more stable. I had a job, I had a house. And so he would let the kids come stay with me. And I started to feel more confident. Like, I was not at that point ready to tuck my tail between my legs and go back to meetings because I knew that I couldn't handle that. But I started to feel confident that I could figure out some sort of life. I could create a new life. I didn't necessarily know what, but I was going to live for the sake of my kids. I was going to find a way to make it through life, witnesses or not, so that I could create a life for them. And then unfortunately, I found myself unexpectedly pregnant. You grow up with like no idea what life out in the real world is like. And so I was so ill prepared for it. And my very first like boyfriend after my marriage, I ended up pregnant like right away within like a week.
Wow.
And I'm fresh out of this huge trauma, just trying to find some sort of stability. I'm now pregnant. The news of the pregnancy made its way to my family, who told the elders. And at that point, I remember my phone started to ring. I knew that it was the brothers calling me, trying to get me in for, a judicial meeting. I avoided all of the calls. Pretty soon, they were starting to camp outside my apartment. And that point, I was kind of angry. I was irritated. Like, look, I clearly don't want to be there. Just leave me alone.
Mm-hmm.
And these two brothers, which were two brothers I'd grown up with forever, people that I looked to for advice early on in life, these two brothers just sat in their car outside my apartment. And they would hope that they could catch me in some sort of act or catch a guy walking into my apartment so that they could have that as their grounds for disfellowshipping me.
Mm-hmm.
I My mom had eventually reached out and she just pleaded with me, "Hey, for our sake, so that we can have closure, can you please just meet with the elders? We need this closure. I cannot hear about this anymore. I need it to be done with."
Yeah,
And
I
so,
mean, it's clearly about them.
oh, it is.
Yeah.
Hey, she doesn't like the way that it makes her feel, and then it makes her feel ashamed of me. So she just wants it over with so that people don't talk about me anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
And obviously, I mean, that's a
Goodness.
huge, anytime there's drama in the Kingdom Hall, people talk about it.
Of course. Oh yeah.
And
Absolutely.
mine was like mega drama. I mean, I can only imagine how I would have reacted hearing my story as just another witness.
Right.
So these people, I had been in the same congregation for like 20 years at that point. I mean, they talked about it. It was the hot gossip. And so my mom had to hear that, and it just made her feel ashamed, I think. And so I ended up caving. I met with the three elders, which were all people I'd grown up with, that I'd known since I was really young. They ended up asking all of the gross details, which I know is the case in judicial meetings. And it just creeped me out so badly. They asked in depth details about the personal situation that got me to that point. And I refused. And they kept pushing, like, just tell us this, tell us that. Just totally gave me a vibe that I was ready to get out of that room. And so I ended up telling him, like, "Hey, look, none of this matters. I'm only here for my mom. You obviously know that I'm pregnant. There's the proof that you need
Yeah.
that I've, committed a sin. Like, can we just get this over with?" So I cut the meeting short. I left. One of the brothers, I can remember, kept telling me at the end, he gave me a hug when the others felt very judgmental. This one brother gave me a hug and he said, "You're never lost. There's always hope." And that definitely struck me. I appreciated it, but I was so hurt by the other two who, even though they knew me since I was a kid, they had zero compassion or zero desire
Mm-hmm.
to try to see if there was anything they could do to get me back. And so the next Tuesday, I think it was, I was disfellowshipped. My mom had texted me and said it was announced. And so it was official. I was disfellowshipped, and all of my family, followed the rules closely. There was no communication. My ex-husband only communicated with me as needed for stuff with the children.
Mm-hmm.
So I was pretty lost at this point. I was alone. I was no longer with the father of the baby. I was pregnant. I knew that this baby was going to have a totally different life than my other two. They wouldn't have the same stability. I questioned at that point if I was even enough for the baby. Was I good enough to try to do this on my own? I had resolved that, I would try, I would raise the baby. I didn't need my family, screw all of them. At my 20-week ultrasound, I went in to find out the sex of the baby. And I ended up receiving the news that no one should ever have to hear. They had come in and told me that the baby had actually died.
Mm.
And so I was 20 weeks along, thinking that I was going to go in for this fun ultrasound to find out if it was a boy or a girl. But the baby's heart was not beating. The baby was gone. I later found out from tests that it was a baby girl. I delivered her the next day. They induced me the next day at the hospital, and she was a 5.5-ounce baby girl that fit in the palm of my hand. So at this point, I was pretty certain that God was punishing me. I'd done all of this wrong, and he took my baby.
Yeah.
And so my mom, of course, used this as an opportunity to point out how my life had totally fallen apart. Like,
Oh,
look what
God.
happens. Look what happens when you leave the truth and you don't have the protection of God and the organization. And I was so bitter and so angry that I did view this as God. But if that was God, then screw him,
Heck yeah.
Like, I don't
Yeah.
want to be any part of a God who is going to take my baby because I screwed up.
Yeah. Well, didn't he do that in the Bible? Didn't he do that to
Yeah,
David?
exactly. And I was just so angry at that time. And so she tried to urge me to come back, saying, get your life back on track. Then your family will be here for you. You won't have to do life alone. And so I had those like moments of thinking maybe she's right. I at that point thought it was still the truth.
And doesn't it just go to show how they prey on the vulnerable?
Yes.
They're
Yes.
using as if no witnesses have ever had this happen. It happens inside the organization. It's a natural thing, and it's a sad thing. And I am very sorry that you had to go through that.
Thank you.
It is something that happens inside the organization too. But they seize upon the pain of people on the outside to try to get them on the inside, and it's just
Mhm.
it's awful. It's like ambulance chasing. It's just terrible.
Yeah, when it happens within the congregation, it's just time and foreseen occurrence
Yeah.
befall us all.
Yeah.
But it happens outside the organization, and it's because you're unfaithful or it's because you've committed sin. Those are the reason it's happening to you. And so they again total double standard
I
with
thought with evil things, Jehovah could not test people or whatever.
if only all of their scriptures could jive together instead
Oh
of
yeah.
totally fighting against each other. So at this point, I was pretty angry. I absolutely hated my family for abandoning me when I needed them most. My dad never even called when he heard about the baby. Not a call, not a single phone call from my dad. So at one point, I wrote him a letter. I still lived right near them. And so I wrote this letter explaining how I felt. I would see him drive by a lot. And so I followed him one day when I saw him drive past me in his truck. I like flipped a Yui, followed him to a job site he was going to and gave him my letter, gave him a hug, told him I loved him, got back in the car and left. And so I wrote him this letter just explaining how much I loved him, how sorry I was that I'd been such a disappointment to him, and trying to explain just my reasons why I had fallen apart and made those choices, and just laid it all out thinking, what do I have to lose? He ended up showing up at my work and he had a letter in hand, and I was so excited thinking maybe it's my letter, maybe he's read it, maybe he's had some sort of change of heart. But no, it was a letter from him. He handed it to me and turned around and walked out the door, and it was this typed up letter from him that explained to me how he couldn't even believe where I had ended up, that I was a terrible mother, that I was no daughter of his, and that he really couldn't come to grips with who I was anymore, and that he absolutely was disgusted by me. And so I that as a daddy's girl hit me so hard, and I knew like there's no going back at this point. I knew that I would not go back.
No, that's
Um,
disgusting. Why would you go back to an organization where a man like that could be an elder? Like why that guy is a leader in a congregation. Why would you ever want to go back to a God or a religion that approves of people who are that unloving and just that? I mean, that's just awful. That's so abusive. It's terrible.
and as the people who are supposed to be shepherding the flock, like there
Yes.
was no attempt at shepherding.
No.
He couldn't. I knew that had I been someone else going through this in the congregation, that he would have been able to be the type to reach out and to say, come in, let's have a shepherding call, let's do the encouraging things to try to help. But because I was his daughter, it was a totally different treatment, and he was just completely and utterly disgusted with me from the moment that I made a bad choice. I had never rebelled my entire life. And here at, 26 years old, I was rebelling. And I remember telling him, you rebelled, mom rebelled, like my sister had rebelled. And now suddenly it wasn't okay for me to go through this tough time and to rebel. And he just kept saying, well, you're an adult making adult choices. We were young. We didn't know any better. And because I was an
Fuck
adult,
that.
yes, because I was an adult, I was supposed to have my act together and I
You
wasn't supposed
attempted
to.
suicide. You
Mhm.
were obviously a very hurting person with issues at the time.
Yeah.
To just boil it down like that and to try to set himself apart as though he was somehow better than you, that's awful.
Yeah, I so badly wanted him to just have empathy for me, thinking like
Yes, they have
I
none.
no, none. They
None.
had made terrible choices and those choices suddenly didn't matter. There was no relating to circumstances that they went through. And so I struggled with that, thinking like, why is it so different for me? Why can I not have this empathy at all? And then I ended up at that point, I was still struggling, fighting quite a bit with my ex husband over custody of our kids. His family, um, his parents, my own parents viewed me as such a detrimental influence to my children that they really attempted to push me out.
Oh, yeah.
I, I can remember at 4 years old, my daughter came over for her time with me and she says to me, Mom, why do you worship the devil? And I was like, who told you that? Well, daddy told me you worship Satan. And having to explain from a very young age, they were 3.5 and 1 when I attempted suicide. So they were young. And I had to explain to them, yes, mommy made mistakes, but everybody makes mistakes, and gently break them of the mind washing, the brainwashing that was going on. I never wanted to be the type that badmouthed them or badmouthed their dad.
Yeah.
So I tried to be really gentle and try to tell them that it's okay for people to believe different things, and to let them put two and two together on their own. So that was really tough for me, just having that constant fight of these are my kids and other people feel that I do not even deserve them.
Yeah, and they're trying to they're trying to turn your kids against you too. They're trying to make the kids feel like you don't deserve them.
Mm-hmm.
That's so insidious.
And they had, so much opportunity at that point. The kids were young. They were, so moldable. And
Yeah.
so they could, use that as their chance to jump on the opportunity to really turn them against me. At this point, I still thought holidays were wrong. It's kind of ironic. Like I'd gone through so much, but I still thought the holidays were wrong. So
Sure.
my friends would tell me like, just hang an ornament on a tree, just do it. And I couldn't do it. Like I felt like lightning was going to strike me through the ceiling if I put an ornament on a tree. So at some point I thought like, what the hell? I've done so much else wrong. Like the holidays are probably the least of my sins. So I started to celebrate holidays. My 27th birthday was my first birthday. It was the first one that I celebrated. My friends, made a big deal out of it, which was cool. I started to see the light around this point, started to really make the connection of how wrong their treatment was. As I started to get more mentally stable, I could put together how warped their beliefs were and how they should have handled things differently and been there. And so I started to really like come to as I felt, and I started to seek out old friends on Facebook that I knew had also left the truth, at that point feeling comfortable. I don't care if people view that person as an apostate. I'm going to talk to them.
Yeah.
And so I started to hang out with people that were ex-J-Dub. I leaned on them a lot during that time as I had questions. One of my friends introduced me to the book Crisis of Conscience, and I read that book and felt like my whole childhood was a total sham.
Yeah.
I like burned through the book so quickly and couldn't put it down, and I just felt like my jaw was on the floor the whole time. I felt like they had duped all of us. And
Yep.
suddenly this light switch was turned on and I could see it for what it was. it was no longer something that was just too much for me or too overwhelming. It was a total and utter lie. I so badly wanted for my family to see what I was seeing. Like, I've had this revelation. Can please I just pass this on to them so that they can see it too? And so I reached out to my mom over text, just begging her. She liked to read. I said, please, can you just read this book? Like, make the decision for yourself, decide for yourself how you feel, but just read it. And my dad, as an elder, intercepted that text message. Obviously, it didn't go over well. And he texted me and told me not to speak to her anymore, especially with my apostate things that I was pushing on her. And then at that point, finding out that pretty much everything that your entire life revolved around was a farce, it was really weird. If none of that was true, then what is true? You start going through the questions of what's the point of life? Where do I go from here? What do I do with my future? I didn't exactly know what to believe in. I knew that what I had grown up with was wrong, but I didn't really have anything else to believe in for a really long time. I kind of just took life one day at a time. I really soaked up the fact that I was still alive. I had this life that I wasn't supposed to have. And so I viewed it as these bonus days that I shouldn't have got. I didn't, like I mentioned before, I didn't teach my kids to necessarily think contrary to what their dad was ingraining in them. But at this point, I really knew that I had to save them, that it was my job to do whatever I can to make sure that they don't end up in this same situation.
Yeah, you're the only chance they have of having an alternate view or anything to even balance it out.
And I think had I, when I was young, had anyone in my life that allowed me to ask these questions that, just weren't okay to ask, or to have some sort of contrary opinion, it's always good to see both sides of everything, but it just simply was not allowed. I was so surrounded by only Jehovah's Witnesses that there was never that opportunity. And so I knew that I was really my kids' only chance to have another view of life. And so I tried to always give them the information from a very young age and then let them connect the dots. I remember when they were young, I started to talk to them about love. That was something I always used the example of. I would say, the Jehovah's Witnesses teach you that God is love. And obviously we all want to show love. Do you think God, as a loving God, would want you to shun your family? I said, do you think that it's right that my mom and dad would do this to me? I'm their daughter. And my daughter would make that correlation like, no, mom, that's not loving. And let them, understand for themselves how the teachings that they were learning were contrary to the behaviors of their family. Mm-hmm. And still up until now, the scariest thing for me in life is that they're going to decide to follow their dad's path, to turn 18, to choose to cut me off. It almost freezes you with fear because you can't even imagine that. And so I push really hard to be a positive influence for them and to give them the opportunity to choose something else and then just hope for the best that they do.
Yeah.
I met my current husband online back in 2015. At this point, I had really come a long way. I had a really good job. I was doing really well. The poor guy, I laid out all my drama on the first phone call with him. And I don't know why, because that had to have been a lot of information, but
you probably needed to get it out.
I pretty much was just like, this is the crazy that you're getting into if you choose to take me. So before we even met in person, he, was really sympathetic to my situation, and he listened with love and understood early on what I had gone through. And so he knew that I was really bitter towards God. I didn't know if there was a God. If there was a God, I hated him. And so he was really there for me. knowing that, I didn't care about having any sort of like spiritual health or any sort of spiritual belief at that time.
Hmm.
So he was a huge influence for me and slowly opening my eyes and viewing that, yes, maybe there is a God, and
Hmm.
maybe just the view that I was shown as a child is wrong of God. So I feel like I'm still connecting the dots on what my own beliefs are.
Sure.
That's really hard for me, having such a concrete idea growing up of what was true and what was untrue. You think you have all the answers, and to now not is a struggle. And
There's a to be able to be comfortable not knowing something
mhm.
is or an uncertainty is something that we were not taught at all.
And you think, okay, why do we suffer and die? X, Y, and Z. Why does this happen? X, Y, and like you just have an answer for everything
Yep.
when you're growing up. And so suddenly you're like, I don't know why the hell that happens. And I don't know why the hell I'm here. Like, I don't know. And so that was just a big struggle, and to let go of any bitterness towards, Christianity, towards a God, to just finally let that go. I think that was really healing for me, to just feel like it's okay to not know, and it's okay to start to believe again in a different way. And so I've
Hmm.
been putting together the pieces of how I feel. Um, when I left the truth, I went back to the Kingdom Hall a couple of times. My kids are now older, they're 8 and almost 11. And so they're now unbaptized publishers through their dad.
Hmm.
And I found out that they were going to give talks. They came to me and they said, at separate occasions, "Hey, Mom, I'm giving my first talk." And they asked me to come. And so I had that moment of, what do I do? Like, my babies want me there. And so I explained to them that I would go, that I didn't in any way, shape, or form agree with the teachings, but that I supported them. And so if it was important to them that I go, that I wanted to be there for them.
Hmm.
So I decided on both of their talks. I've been a few times to go and to support them. And so I walk into the Kingdom Hall, obviously having the stress and panic that leads up to walking in. And then you walk in and my palms just instantly start to sweat
Yeah.
and my stomach starts to knot up. And I just have this full body reaction to the Kingdom Hall itself. And that's when it really hit me, like, this place was the reason I felt like this so much of my childhood.
Yeah.
This is why. And so I go, I do it anyways. I sit proudly in the front row. I can feel the eyes of my parents, my ex-husband, his parents, all my old friends just burning into the back of my head. Like,
Oh,
I
you
know
sat in
that.
the front row.
Oh, I sat in the front row,
Oh, I love that.
right in front, like
Yes.
front and center. I am stubborn as hell. So I was
I
just like,
love it.
screw you all. So, and I show up early, which you're not
Yes.
supposed to do. And I
Love it.
show up early and I sit there for like 20 minutes before the meeting. And it's really sad because my son, being younger, he will run up to me, give me a hug, say, he missed me, talk to me while I'm there. My daughter feels so much anxiety. The few times that I've been, she says hi and then tries to avoid me, like, "Oh, I have to go to the bathroom." And she'll
Oh.
hide. She was hiding in the bathroom because she was so scared that if she talked to me, she would get in trouble. And that was so hard for me to accept, to see my own daughter completely avoid me because she felt that's what she was supposed to do. She is a completely different person with me when she's not around the Jehovah's Witnesses, but she gets in that environment and
Oh
she's
yeah.
like, "Oh crap, I can't talk to mom. Dad's going to be mad at me if I talk to mom." And,
Yep.
I'm not supposed to do that. And so I try to take it easy on her. I really try to understand that it's, what they teach her, but I'll explain to her, how do you think that makes mom feel? And, try to just be honest with her about
Yes, you're
how it,
teaching empathy.
yeah, how would you feel if I went to your school and I sat in your class, but I talked to everybody else but you. Like, would that hurt your feelings? Well, yeah, it would hurt my feelings. That's how you made me feel. And so she kind of had that eye-opening experience of the other side of it. And I
Yeah.
don't want to make, mom feel that way. And so trying to just get her to understand while still having understanding that it's just so much pressure on her, and letting her decide for herself how she's going to work through that. So I'd sit up there in the front row recording my babies during their talks. I would stay, for that first half, clap when it was over. When I would go to leave at the middle half, you don't leave until the song if you're leaving early.
Oh, yes.
I would go during the song over to their dad where the kids were, and in front of everybody, give them a hug, tell them I was proud of them. Everybody's eyes watching me the whole time. Like, what is she doing? Why didn't she just like slink out of here in shame?
I
so
love this so much.
I just, try to make it a point to
Yes.
no, you're going to see that I'm here, and you're going to see that my kids are important to me. Like,
Yes.
screw you all. Not the
Yes.
language I typically use, but like, screw you all. And so no matter what they believe, I feel like I do a pretty good job of letting them decide. And I just hope, they become who they want to become. I say that all the time. You can be whoever you want to be, whatever you want to be. Mom's always there for you.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I, on the contrary, have since walked into a Christian church, and my anxiety going into another church was so through the roof.
Oh, I bet.
I was so worried that all of those same feelings I had had walking into a Kingdom Hall would be the same walking into this church. I felt like, should I even be walking into this church? I walked into the one I've been to most often, and it instantly felt different. The people were dressed in jeans or dresses if they preferred, sweatshirts, hats, whatever. It was so completely different than the stuffy environment that we'd grown up with.
Yeah, but they were dressed like that because they don't love God.
Right, yeah.
Because
You're
we were
clearly
taught
not
so many
showing
things
your
about
respect to him
Yes.
if you're not in your oversized suit that doesn't fit you.
Yeah.
And
God can only love you if you're wearing a tie or a dress that comes to the knees or below.
and you can make sure you have your leggings on, your
Oh,
tights on,
Yes,
no
yes,
toe
yes.
rings,
Yes,
no jean
yes.
skirts.
Yes, and don't look too flashy. Look nice, but not too nice.
Not too much bling, because you wouldn't
Yes.
want to draw attention.
Yeah, no tuxes here, just suits.
So that was like such a huge contrast for me. I
Yeah.
was kind of in this state of shock. And then I walk in, and there's like this full band on the stage. And I'm like, what the hell is going on here? Like, I just looking around at everything and kind of soaking it all in. Like, the drums are going crazy, the guitar is going crazy. And I'm just like, what the heck is this? Like, I don't know how to compute it all. And then the worship music started, and I remember feeling so totally different. It was like a very emotional experience to me, and so different than like the Kingdom melodies we grew up with. And that fear of how I would feel, even, being in a church or being open to any idea of God, totally went away. And so during the worship music, I just felt, okay, if there's Holy Spirit, this is some time that I'm going to feel Holy Spirit. I'm not going to feel it at a Kingdom Hall. It's just not there. I know it's not there. And so I felt really good during the worship music. I would feel these waves of emotions and know that, that he was there. I still struggle with hearing like sermons for me, because I always feel that panic reaction of feeling like they're preachy.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely connect to the music more, and I'm becoming, more open, and try to just always view things with an open mind. Like, if I go, I don't go all the time. If I go, I sit there and I can listen, and sometimes just really relate to what's being said. And at other times be like, okay, I totally don't agree with that. And it's okay. It's okay to not feel the same as everybody, and to be able to have an open mind and say like, nah, like that doesn't really compute with my beliefs.
You mean you won't be shunned?
No, I won't. It's okay. So
Imagine that.
figuring out my way through all of what I believe has been hard in a progression. I remember I couldn't pray for the longest time. I'd spent so long hating God and just feeling unworthy and mad at him for what he'd done to me, and just praying felt wrong. And so the biggest advice I was given by my husband is to just start small, to try something, see if it feels right, to trust your gut and kind of let in the good. And so I really try to just have an open mind and to do whatever I feel like feels right. I feel like most people who have left the truth have become either agnostic or atheist.
Raise his hand.
Yes. And all of my friends were, all of my ex J-Dub friends have not stepped foot in another church. They have zero desire to. And I felt like that's kind of where I was different. Is I was like, I still want to believe in something, but I don't know what. And so I'm one of the few who aren't agnostic or atheist. I really understand why they are, because for a long time I felt that way too. And so I can see completely why they have that view, and it's so far different than my view, and I can say that's okay. Like, I love to hear your viewpoint on things. This is my viewpoint on things. I feel like I'm just one of the few who still has any faith left.
Sure.
Because
And there are others. There are others for sure.
they like ruin faith for you. You don't have faith because it's so ruined. So although it's really different than the faith that the faith that we thought we had growing up, I feel like I still have faith. And so that's one thing that I am still working my way through. One thing that I have prayed, I thought, if I'm going to pray, the one thing that's worth praying for is more time with my kids. Like, every time I battled with their dad to see them, or I knew the evil things that were being like shoved into their mind, I would just pray, like, please, if you're there, God, help me get through this. And so I left in 2012. Now roll around to January of 2019. I finally hired another lawyer. I really had no clue as to how I was going to afford it, how it was going to turn out, like hoping that this time was different. Their dad has not gotten any less stubborn. He still is just as much of a-hole as he was back then. And so I kind of just tried to have faith. Okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to hope that it turns out differently. So I put the retainer down, really just hoping that this time would be different. And October of this year, he finally caved out of nowhere. He finally just stopped fighting. We had gone through this new court case for 10 months at this point, and he stopped fighting. He gave me just over 50% custody of my kids.
Oh, congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you. Like, that to me was just everything I had been fighting for. I had fought and fought and fought for years. And so now I've got my kids 50-50. I have, two amazing stepkids that are really close in age to mine. Been married 3 years now. We are, we just are figuring out our own life. We have a new life. We have friends that have become family. I always say, I don't have my own family because they're not there for me. I have my family, as we call them. So, you have your Friendsgiving and you do those things that make you feel like you still have family. It's just, they're not blood.
Yeah. And they treat you better than your actual family, usually.
Yep. They see you, make bad choices, and they don't judge you for it. They'll sometimes tell you you're being an idiot, but they give you the benefit of telling you you're an idiot. And that's one thing I really appreciate. Like, I have friends from all walks of life. One of my very best friends is a Mormon, and I have such polar opposite views as her, and we can sit there and we can talk about them. And then at the end of the day, none of it matters. I have, like I said, friends who have no belief in God. They're completely atheist, agnostic. And it just, that doesn't come between our relationships. It doesn't come between our friendships. My love for them or their love for me isn't contingent on having the same beliefs.
Yep.
And I so appreciate that, because you're just not allowed to think differently. My parents have made the clear distinction. You don't believe the same as us? Okay, sorry, you're out of our lives. And so to know that in the outside world that's not necessarily the case has been really eye-opening.
Mm-hmm.
I think like by now it's gotten easier to just kind of accept that this is life. I think you just get into these new patterns and these new habits. But at the same time, it never gets easier to accept that life has changed so drastically that you may never have your family again. I have mentioned before, people always say, like, they'll come around, give them
Oh, I hate
time.
that. That's the worst.
Yeah,
It
don't
just
tell me that.
it holds out false hope for people, and it just yeah, I'm a big believer in acceptance, and coming to that point, and I've seen people, including myself, get there, but um, so I'll continue to hold out false hope to people. I know why people do it, because they don't want to see you unhappy, and that they want to continue to hold out this hope so that you have that to hold on to. But if you continue to hold on to it too desperately, it just creates a false expectation that then creates a lot of heartache and pain.
It does.
And
so
they mean well, but it's
Yeah.
not. It's like, people do the same thing with people who have a terminal illness. They'll give them false hope, and
Mhm.
it doesn't really help them accept where they are and work through it. It keeps them in another, looking at what they could have instead of what they actually have.
Yeah, and they feel like it's what they should say. So
Yeah.
when people find out my story, they always throw that out there. And I, politely like, hey, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm like, no, they won't. Like,
Yeah,
that's not gonna
and it
happen.
puts you in that place too, where you have to keep saying like, no, they won't, or
Yep.
educating people on it, and that's not always comfortable either.
Yeah. And it's been hard accepting like the life events that have happened since then. I think those are the moments when I really miss them the most. I got married again. I had to accept that my dad wasn't going to walk me down the aisle this time.
Yeah.
My youngest son walked me down the aisle, and I had to just be okay with that and be excited about the fact that my son was there for me. He got to do it. So any of those monumental life events really hit me hard. I've had a couple of nephews that have been born since I left, and anytime I hear, about a birth, I really struggle, because I was so close to them before. I was there for the births of, my nieces,
Mm-hmm.
my nephew, like just accepting that they'll never know me. My sister's kids have seen me a few times. When family members have, passed away and things like that at funerals, and they'll be like, who's that, mommy? Who's
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
And oh, that's my sister. It's your sister. Why do we never see her? And so that kills me. That's when it's really hard for me.
Yeah. I think
Just no. Go ahead.
just you talking about it just kind of made me realize that I think that on some level, the resurrection hope that we were taught, I think that I almost use that on a level, because my family sees me as dead.
Mm-hmm.
And to be quite honest, I see them as dead. If they were resurrected someday, if you know what I'm saying, like if they came
Mm-hmm.
out, then I would be thrilled.
Yeah.
And I would be there for them, and I would help them. But if and until that happens, I think that, I kind of see them. I've accepted the way they see me. They see me
Mm-hmm.
as dead, and I think I kind of see them the same way. I've grieved that and gone through that process, and doing so, I think, has helped me to accept that on a level. And honestly, it just kind of struck me like it's the hope they gave me, almost is what I'm using on some level to help
Yeah.
me through it.
Yeah. You're like, thanks for that life tip.
yeah. They could, if they come back someday, if they get out, I'll be thrilled. I'm still not under the auspice that if they get out, things are going to be super great. I don't know,
Mhm.
because we'll have to get to know each other as completely new people.
Yeah.
because it's like what you're saying. You're at your best now, and what sucks is that you're finally like wholly becoming you, and probably happier than you've ever been in your life. And they don't ever get to see that. My parents don't know me my dad's dead now, but my mom, unless she ever comes out, will never know me as who I really am.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a shame.
It is. It's such a shame. Having reached this point in my life where life's always hard, but I have a great family. I have a great relationship. I've got my kids. I'm doing by all things what is expected in life. I have a great job, and I'm doing these things that from an outside view makes you successful. And I feel like I'm successful, but in their mind, I am not successful. And that's so hard for me to feel like I have a successful life. I am doing really well. I've been mentally stable for so long because I was finally able to get the help that I need. I'm a huge proponent for mental health. I have since participated in the suicide prevention walk every year since I've left.
Out of the dark?
Yes. Yeah. So I go to that. I take my kids. We make shirts for it. It's a huge deal because I want to bring awareness to mental health and to say, look, even if you struggle from, a one-time event or a lifetime mental health issue, you can be okay. Like you can have a normal life. My mom was bipolar, and by not addressing it, I think you take away your opportunity to treat it correctly and to have a normal life.
Yes. You have to face it. You have to look at it, and you have to get help.
Yeah. And so encouraging other people, I've tried to always be super honest about my suicide attempt. So many people are so embarrassed if they've attempted suicide. I, for that reason, tattooed a semicolon on my hand. It's right on the top of my hand.
Nice.
I get people ask me about it all the time. What does that mean? I work in a very professional environment, and it still shows every day.
Mm-hmm.
And people will say, what does that mean? And so that opens up the opportunity to tell them, this is what the semicolon means. This is what the significance is for me. This is why I chose to put it there. And so having those conversations and just not being ashamed of it, making sure that I'm open to my children about what I went through. Yep. They participate in those events with me. My extra bonus children participate. My husband participates. They all go. And I think that opens up the door for them to know if they hit a point in life where they face those same things, they can come to me and say, hey, Mom, we know you struggle. Can you help us?
Yes, because the world at large shames it as well. It's not just Jehovah's Witnesses. The world at large, there's been a huge stigma against mental illness or suicide, and it's through shining out. Shame lives in the dark. When you shine a light on it, it goes away. And that you doing that and having these walks, talking to your kids, that's beautiful because it is going to allow them. It normalizes it to the point where when someone has those feelings, they don't have to feel ashamed, and they can actually reach out for help instead of feeling alone.
Yeah. And that's my biggest hope is, for anyone that might be struggling. I for years, and I'm sad that in my anxiety and stress of normal everyday life, I've gotten away from this, but I used to make so much effort to smile at people wherever I went. I would consciously try to, hey, that person looks like they're having a bad day at the grocery store or wherever. I would just smile at them because I knew sometimes people just need a friendly face. And if an opportunity arose to talk about my circumstance and to give someone hope that you can be at the worst of the worst and the darkest point in your life, and you can recover from that, I think that just gives them the opportunity to sit and reflect and say, look, I am going through this terrible time, and it seems like it will never get better, but it will get better. And I think the more that people are open to talk about that and to share their stories if they've been through a circumstance, I would love to know the statistics behind how many people either in the Jehovah's Witnesses or that have attempted to leave have attempted suicide. It's got to be so high.
Yeah, it does. It has to be high. I don't know how you would go about getting those statistics, but yes, it has to be very high. I think we all know somebody who either did commit suicide or someone who attempted, or I never attempted, but honestly, it was only because my wife and I worked together and we're literally together 24/7.
Yeah.
Had I been
The
alone,
opportunity wasn't
I
there.
did not have the opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I probably would have at least attempted.
Yeah.
Because it's just a miserable place to be, and there's a lot of people out there that have, if nothing else, had ideations, and it comes from living in that environment where you can't be yourself, and you have to pretend every day, and face the depression and the anxiety that comes from living with a hope that is so dystopian, and living with the pressures of an organization that's so performance oriented, and then the shame that they use on people.
Yeah, and the shame that people feel when they leave. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
the whole point of shunning is to sit you in timeout so that you feel the need to come with your tail between your legs and to say, no, please love me, take me back, I'm sorry. And so those people don't know how to cope with life in the real world. And I think so many people either turn to some sort of vice, they become alcoholics, or they turn to drugs, or they do attempt suicide, for those ones who aren't prepared to have a normal life. And the shunning works, but in a totally different way. It works to the point where those people feel so terrible about themselves and what they've done that they attempt suicide or turn to these vices. And the shunning has this whole extra effect. It didn't do what they thought it was, but it certainly made those people feel terrible, like it was supposed to.
Yeah, and I'll add to that if it doesn't make someone go to a dark place where they do attempt on some level, or even have the ideations. I meet a lot of people who have spent decades not living life, because they still feel so much shame, and because they're afraid to look at any of this stuff. And especially looking at, mentally diseased apostates material, and we are the ones who hold the key to healing, because we've been there and we can talk about it. And it's through being open and vulnerable that you're finally going to find freedom. And if you stay, so there are people who literally lose their lives, but there are people who also give up decades of their lives living out patterns and roles in the story that they were given about how life would be when they left. And it's a shame.
It is. It's such a shame. They never can get over that. I know that I struggled with that for a long time. Sure. I would attempt to try to show up where I knew my parents were, to just tell them I loved them, or I would text them and say, I love you. I hadn't accepted. I hadn't moved on. I didn't know what to do with myself. And so I finally hit this really great place of just accepting. I know that they are gone from my life. I am sad about that, but I don't hold anger towards them anymore. I don't hurt myself by keep reaching out and by keeping to try to hold out that spark for him, that flame. Like, it's going to happen one day. I just have accepted it. I am okay with it. And I've made the most of having my own life separate from them. I hope that on some level they deep down, although they'd never admit it, that they look at my life and are proud of me, but I can almost guarantee that they aren't. And that's okay. It's okay to know that they don't have to feel proud of me for me to feel proud of me and what I've accomplished.
No, that's beautiful. Yeah. And that's really gets into boundaries. Boundaries are where I end and you begin, and you can feel proud of you, and it doesn't really matter what they think. It doesn't, because they have skewed views anyway. So, their view of why they would be proud of you is based on erroneous false information, so they don't have good standards there.
Definitely. So that's my story.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you. So, what do you love about your new life? Now that you are out, and it sounds like you've got a lot of things going for you. What do you love about your life?
I love holidays. That's one thing that
Yeah.
I have truly accepted. Like my husband and I always call ourselves like Clark Griswold. We love Christmas. We love the feeling that we get watching our kids, be happy just the weeks that lead up to it with the movies and the feeling. So much of that loving environment that the holidays create, or an opportunity to make each of my kids feel like they're so special when it's their birthday. I try to really make a big deal out of their birthday and just tell them, you are so special. I am so glad you were born. And we celebrate that. So holidays for me have become a lot of fun, just really embracing everything and getting over that anxiety of like, are they wrong? It's just, no, I accept them with open arms now. I love the freedom to believe whatever I believe, to have that view be ever changing. My beliefs and my faith has changed so much over the course of the last few years, and to know that that's okay, and to
Sure.
know even a year from now or 2 years from now, it'll be totally different than it is now. I don't have to stick to what someone else is telling me. I I really love and appreciate that I've just created this new life, having a great husband and the support of him, and knowing what I've been through, and to really encourage me to talk about it. I just really appreciate him for that, and having these kids, all four kids that I get an opportunity to raise differently than I was raised.
That's awesome. Do you have any dreams looking forward? Anything that you would like to do?
I do. So one thing, as my kids are getting older, my oldest son, my stepson, is 13. And so we're like aiming him towards the college route at this
Mhm.
point. You're trying to encourage higher education. And so I have hit this phase lately of feeling like I want to challenge myself to attempt to go back to school. I got my GED at 16. I didn't even go to high school.
Mhm.
And I just, it wasn't something that you did. And so I would love the opportunity. It would be a real challenge with my schedule, but to go to college, to
Mhm.
say to my kids, like, if I can do it, you can do it.
I like that. I like that. Do you know what you would want to go to college for, or what specialty or what you would like to study?
Yeah, so I'm currently a property manager, which is great, but it also definitely has its stresses. And one thing, the projects I've worked on have been new construction. And so I grew up in construction with my dad. I have decided or thought about going to school to get my master's in business with a focus on project management, so that I could aim to go that construction route,
Mhm.
hopefully oversee some of the bigger construction projects that we do have, so I could still be involved in what I do love about what I currently do, but on a whole different side of it.
That's awesome. I love that. I love, having something to shoot for, even if, a goal is just a direction. Even if you don't hit that one particular thing, you might pivot at some point and realize that, maybe that's not exactly it, but this thing over here is it. But we don't
hmm
know if we don't try.
Yep,
Um,
that's how you grow. You
yeah.
grow by giving yourself, these goals and these challenges, and to say like, okay, I've overcome that and I've accomplished that. What can I do now? Like the sky's the limit. What can I do now?
Yeah, that's beautiful. And what a beautiful um, what a beautiful thing to have in your life, to be able to grow now instead of, I don't know about you, but anytime I spoke to my witness family, it was pretty much Groundhog Day. Every day was the same. Not
Yep.
much changed. There might be a new witness video or something like that, or a new song to sing at the Kingdom Hall, but nothing was changing. And what's the point of life if you're not going to grow throughout it? So
Yeah.
I'm glad that you have goals, and you can inspire your kids. I'm sure you'll inspire other people through, telling your story today. And I really appreciate you doing so.
No, thank you so much. It's so nice. Like I told you before, to just know you're not alone. I listened to your podcast just out of the blue. I felt the need to find some sort of podcast, I think, because I was missing my family, and found your podcast, and just to listen to your whole story and to feel like, oh my gosh, someone else grew up so similarly to me and they're going through it too. I'm not alone. And it just always helps to know you're not alone.
I want to thank everybody, all these 10 episodes that I'm releasing pretty much at once. I want to, thank everybody who was brave enough to tell their stories. It takes courage to speak out. And I know it's very cathartic for people to listen back to later. So I wish the best for everybody. If you want to support the podcast and the work that goes into it, or the new website, xjwhelp.com, you can support them both at patreon.com/shunned. Patreon is Patreon. So that's patreon.com/shunned. This work matters. It matters to the people that are listening. That would be you. It matters to the people who are watching videos that are helping to find or finding the help that they need. It matters to the people that get to participate and hear their stories being told in their own voice, or that sometimes reconnect with other people from their past through their episodes, or even, you reach out to these people and leave a comment of encouragement to them. And that matters. It matters to people that are listening that are from other cults, and they get to see that they aren't alone because there's so many similarities. So if this matters to you, please support it so we can help more people. You can also support by leaving a 5-star review for both Shunned and This JW Life, my initial podcast. These reviews help others to find these stories so that we can help them heal. And if you hear an episode that you like, share it on social media. Tell others on the XJW Reddit or some group about it. Wherever you are, if there's something that impacts you, one of the highest compliments you can ever pay is to pay it forward and to tell other people about the episode or the podcast in general, or the coaching or the Shunned Recovery Project, or whatever it is that's helping you. Please help share it to other people, because there are a lot of people that don't know these things exist. If you like, that goes for the new site as well. If you like the new site, xjwhelp.com, please share it to others. Keeping it to yourself isn't going to help anybody. So let's make 2020 the start of something big as a community. Support good work. Participate if you can. Help others, and let's take our power back. If you want individual help, then reach out to me through xjwhelp.com or shunnedpodcast.com. Leave a message of support for the people telling their stories. Get resources mentioned on the website along with links to support the show, or contact me if there's something that you need to discuss. Join the Shunned Podcast Facebook group, which is a support group. So get involved. If we want something different, then we're going to have to do something different. Let's be the start. The song for the show today, as always, is No Hell Yet by Fair Voyeur. And as I end all episodes, love others, do no harm, and go be happy.
Curse God